My soldiers, ever since the sheriff put down his arms for the last time and set off towards the sunset, we have allowed Chieftain Mahomes and his warriors to grow strong and rule the West for the last 7 years. Well, I say that time is over. So let us ride and take back what is once, and it is rightfully ours. Ah! If you think this is what fantasy football is, you're gravely mistaken. Fantasy football is not some D&D copy where running backs are dwarves, wide receivers are knights, and quarterbacks are wizards. No. Fantasy football, what makes it a fantasy, is that you can have any players from around the NFL who wouldn't ordinarily, not be playing together, and put them on the same team. Like, say, Cooper Kupp and Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott and George Kittle, Russell Wilson and the Denver Broncos. Wait, that actually happened? Interesting. No. Fantasy football is more of just what you would do if you were a coach or general manager of a team. You'd have to draft players, assign them to their spots for the game, scout players to see who's the best, and win. Hopefully. Now, this job, in particular, the drafting part, is excruciatingly hard. Because, despite being fantasy, it involves real-life choices from humans who are imperfect and will obviously cause lots of mistakes down the line. Because you know what? We can't make every decision just right. We will screw up eventually. And there are many common mistakes made in fantasy football that I have seen throughout my 7 years of playing, and many that I have made myself, that I'd like to share with you and also give you tips on how to avoid this. Now, this video is specifically meant for, say, a beginner to fantasy football who's like their first season and they don't really know what they're doing. Obviously, if you're a pro, you can watch this and just get a few reminders, listen to my strategy, whatever. I am Sam Ruffing, host of Roughing the Passer, and after starting out my first 2 fantasy seasons with, well, absolutely terribly, I have since gone on to make my league championships game the last 3 years. And the main reason is because of the draft strategies I use and the mistakes I have learned to avoid over the years that I thought I'd share with you today. Here are 5 mistakes made by new fantasy players and 5 tips on how to avoid them. Mistake number 1, not having a single clue who to draft. Obviously, if you played fantasy football, you always have that first season you go into, that first draft, and you walk in, you're big, calm, and confident, and you sit down and look at all the players available to draft when it's your pick, and you're like, oh boy, that's more than I thought. I don't know half these names, or 80% of these names, and it's my pick. So you go scrolling down to see if you recognize a player, and you're like, I think he's pretty good, and you draft him, and it turns out you drafted the 56th overall best player at spot number 5. This is common, I imagine. And some advice I'd like to share for those rookie fantasy players is tip number 1 on how to avoid this. Most fantasy websites that you play on, like Yahoo, NFL, ESPN, I'm sure, have the players ranked from top to bottom, best to worst. If you're not entirely sure what to do, I suggest just drafting the player that's higher. Draft players higher up on the board that say, hey, because they rank them like, these guys are the best currently available right now. Avoid searching too deep, because you'll end up drafting Darren Sproles. I did that one year because I'm like, he's good. That was my first season. It didn't end well. Yeah. Mistake number 2. Drafting positions way too early. Quarterback in the 1st, kicker in the 5th, defense in the 3rd. Does this sound right to you? If so, you're wrong. These positions, specifically, are all readily available, and honestly, they only take up one spot on your game day roster. Unlike, say, wide receivers and running backs. Now, tight end only takes up one spot, but those are rare, and the difference between the top tight ends and the lower tight ends are very different. If you're wasting those picks on positions that aren't really too necessary, quarterback sometimes, but never first round, really. Never, ever first round. Maybe 2013 Peyton Manning, but that's it. These guys only take up one spot on your one spot on your game day roster. And honestly, they're a dime a dozen. You'll go through like 3 kickers every season, 5 defenses, and maybe 3 quarterbacks. My tip for avoiding this is a simple formula on what rounds not to draft these players. Or which rounds to draft players. So first round should always be, at least 95% of the time, unless there's a generational talent, tight end, should be wide receivers, running backs, first round. That's generally a given because those guys take up multiple spots in your roster and they perform dominantly. Now, I would recommend most of the time a top running back if you're more on the top of the draft, like top 5. Later than that, you can get away with a receiver, but you generally want to draft those 2. Don't draft a quarterback till after round 2. Again, round 2 is for tight ends, running backs, wide receivers. Quarterbacks, generally round 3 and higher. Never draft a defense till after round 5 or 4. This one's tough because a great defense is always helpful whenever you're in fantasy. We all know that, but deciding where to draft I imagine, is very subjective. Sometimes you can get away with it by drafting them 8th. Sometimes you can draft them 4th. That all depends. Never draft a kicker in front of round 8. I mean, for goodness sake, there are kickers everywhere, and they're all score. I mean, yes, Justin Tucker and Harrison Butker are the cream of the crop, but even then, you don't need to draft them until after round 8. So keep that in mind. Let's recount. Draft wide receivers and running backs round 1. Don't draft a quarterback till after round 2. Don't draft a defense till after around 4 to 6 or late. And don't draft a kicker till after round 8. Does that sound good? Good. Number 3, don't be the homer. What I mean by that is don't draft your 3rd wide receiver on the depth chart over other guys who are clearly better. Trust me. Most of the time, it's not going to pan out. Even the 3rd receiver on the Bucs is not going to be better. Actually, the 3rd receiver on the Bucs is Julio Jones. That might be a good one. But Scotty Miller is not going to be better than your average number 2. Randall Cobb, I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. Now, I'm not sure if I'm really guilty of this. Maybe. I probably have done it in the past. Just taking chances on players and who really shouldn't. I've seen teams draft their 3rd wide receiver before, and just avoid that mistake. It's generally made by rookies. Don't do that. My advice is if you actually have some unequivocal proof that guy is going to bounce off this year, spring off, then go ahead. Take a chance on him as long as there aren't players who are clearly better out there and you have good knowledge of training camps and whatnot. Mistake number 4, not drafting a great tight end. This is one I wholeheartedly believe can help pretty much any fantasy pro, except maybe the top tiers who already know this, or maybe they don't use it, I don't know. Anyways, especially rookies, just get yourself a great tight end early. It is just so painful to miss out on one of the 4 tight ends, great tight ends that come out every year for fantasy, and just be stuck in a continuous cycle of trying to find a decent one in free agency, hoping someone breaks out. Maybe a rookie will be good. It's just not fun. There are running backs and receivers are a dime a dozen. Great tight ends, there are 4, pretty much at their peak every year. There are a few good ones, but great tight ends are basically giving you a free 4 points over your average Joe tight end. A Travis Kelce will give you 4 or 5 extra points over, say, a Noah Fant, a Tyler Higbee. Don't miss out on them. Don't waste time trying to find that hidden gem in free agency, because most of the time it won't work out. Now, my advice on where you should draft them is controversial, maybe. I don't know. I would draft a tight end, if I were you, 2nd round, if you are late, if you have an early pick in it, or maybe 3rd round early, if not many tight ends have gone off the board at that point. If only like 1 tight end's gone off the board and you have an early 3rd round pick, I guess you could lay and wait. But you generally don't want to mess around. Get that tight end, get a huge advantage over the rest of your league, and that will get you more wins. And mistake number 5 is not doing enough research. If you really want to take your team to the next level, you got to find out who the best players are. It's that simple. Who can score the most points for your team on a weekly basis and get you the win over your opponent. And there are tons of YouTubers and fantasy magazines, articles out there everywhere that can help you scout out sleeper picks, X factors, and just the best of the best at every position. I would highly recommend checking out Pro Football Focus on YouTube. They have some, I've used them a couple of times, and they give me some pretty good sleepers. Fantasy Underdog, who is run by Brett Coleman, who does all the film study on his YouTube channel. So you know he's seen who's good and who isn't. I'd highly recommend checking him out. And just do your research. If you want to become good at this game, or great at this game, doing your research, figuring out who's the best, will set you apart so quickly, because you're like, okay, avoid him, draft him, avoid him, draft him. And you'll end up with starting rosters that just breeze your way through the playoffs, through the regular season, and give you that championship glory. This has been Roughing the Passer's top 5 mistakes made by new fantasy players and how to avoid them. If you like my ideas, let me know in the comments below. Hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay notified. I think I'll try to do some more fantasy videos later this year on other things that can really set you apart. And I thank you all for watching. I'll see you later.